Sarah Coltrane was 43 years old, and on the morning this story begins she owned nothing in the world but a tin trunk, a black morning dress gone gray at the seams, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. The bank had taken her farm on the first frost of that October, and the man who signed the papers that put her out onto the road was Elias Merrow, a banker with soft hands and a softer voice, who had once eaten Sunday supper at her table and called her husband a friend. She had nowhere left to go but the river town of Cedar Bend, Missouri, where the auctioneers were selling off whatever the water had washed up or the county had condemned, and it was there, standing in the mud with her $11, that she heard a man laughing about an old sunken barge nobody wanted, rotting at the public dock since before the war, and on a foolish, desperate impulse she raised her hand and bought it for $4. The men around her laughed harder. It was, by every appearance, worthless, a waterlogged hulk of blackened oak that the United States Army itself had written off and abandoned more than 20 years before. But sealed inside that ruined hull was something the Army had lost and never stopped searching for, something that would not only save Sarah Coltrane's life, but would settle a debt this town had been quietly avoiding since 1866. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Sarah Coltrane. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, tell us where you're from in the comments below. Sarah had been raised on the Missouri side of the river, the second daughter of a boatwright named Owen Pruitt, a careful, unhurried man who built John boats and flatboats for every family within 20 miles and who believed, with the quiet stubbornness of a craftsman, that would remembered everything done to it. He kept no sons who lived past infancy, and so it was Sarah who stood at his elbow from the time she was 7 years old, learning to read the grain of a plank the way other girls learned to read scripture, learning which timbers had been cut in winter and would hold true, and which had been cut too green and would warp and betray you in the first hard summer. Her father used to say that a boat was a promise a man made to the water, and that you could always tell an honest promise from a false one if you knew where to look, in the caulking, in the fastenings, in the places a lazy builder hoped nobody would ever check. Sarah listened to him the way some children listen to fairy tales, and without knowing it she was gathering a body of knowledge that the world around her considered useless for a girl. A knowledge of holes and joints and hidden compartments that no one thought to ask a woman about. She married Daniel Coltrane when she was 22, a gentle, quiet man who farmed 40 acres upriver from Cedar Bend and who loved her, everyone said, with an attentiveness that made the other wives a little envious. They had no children who survived to see their 5th birthday, a grief Sarah carried privately and never once let harden her. And instead she poured the tenderness she might have given a child into the land itself, into the animals, into the neighbors who came to her when they were sick or frightened or simply needed someone to sit with them in the dark. She was known, in those years, as a woman you could trust with anything, a secret, a debt, a dying relative's hand, because she had a way of receiving people's troubles without ever making them feel smaller for having them. Daniel used to tell her that her father had taught her to read wood, but that somewhere along the way she had also learned to read people, and that the second skill was rarer than the first. She did not think much of the compliment at the time. She would think of it a great deal, later, when it was nearly all she had left. The Coltranes were not wealthy, but they were steady, and steadiness in that country, in those years after the war, was its own kind of wealth. Cedar Bend had grown up around a bend in the river where steamboats used to take on wood and cargo. And though the war had scarred the town, as it had scarred every river town from Missouri down to the Delta, by the late 1870s it had settled into a modest, dogged prosperity, its docks busy again, its churches full, its bank, the Cedar Bend Trust, presided over by a man named Elias Merrow who had arrived sometime after the war with a Kentucky accent and a talent for making himself indispensable. Merrow was, by the measure most people used, a good neighbor. He loaned money to farmers in lean years. He sat on the church board. He shook every hand in town and remembered every child's name. Sarah's father, before he died, had once remarked that he did not trust a man who was liked by absolutely everyone, because it meant that man had never once told anyone a hard truth. But Owen Pruitt was an old riverman with old riverman suspicions, and nobody paid him much mind. Daniel Coltrane died in the winter of 1886, of a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, taking him with it, and Sarah buried him on the rise above their cabin where he had asked to be laid, facing the river he'd loved. She was 39 years old and, for the first time since childhood, entirely alone. She kept the farm going through sheer will for 3 more years, learning the parts of farming that had always been Daniel's, the mending of fences, the timing of the plow, the endless arithmetic of debts owed against a harvest not yet grown, and she might have gone on managing it indefinitely, had the note on the farm not come due at the worst possible moment. In a year when the corn failed twice and the price of what little she did bring in collapsed at market. She went to Elias Marrow the way half the farmers in the county went to him, hat in hand, asking for patience, for an extension, for the kind of mercy a friend extends to a friend. He gave her, instead, a great deal of warm sympathy and a piece of paper that restructured her loan in terms she did not fully understand until it was too late to undo them. Terms that quietly doubled what she owed and shortened the time she had to pay it. She would learn, much later, that she had not been the only widow he had done this to. And that there was a particular kind of woman he seemed to prefer for it, one with no husband to argue on her behalf, no son old enough to make trouble, no lawyer in the family to read the fine print aloud. By the following October the bank held the deed, the sheriff's men had come with a wagon, and Sarah Coltrane stood on the road above the farm her husband and her own labor had built, watching strangers carry her furniture out into the frost, with nothing to show for 18 years of marriage but a tin trunk and $11. She walked the 6 miles into Cedar Bend because it was the only town she knew, and because the church there, whatever its faults, had never yet turned away a woman with nowhere to sleep. It was on her second morning in town, hollow with cold and shame, that she wandered down to the public dock where the county was auctioning off abandoned and condemned river property, old skiffs, a burned-out mill wheel, a rotted keelboat nobody would touch, trying to see if there was anything among the wreckage she might salvage and sell for a meal. It was there that the auctioneer, more to clear his lot than out of any real hope of a sale, called out the last item of the day, an old flat-hulled cargo barge, sunk to her gunwales in the mud at the far end of the dock for as long as anyone in town could remember, listed in the county's own record simply as abandoned army property, disposition unknown, value nil. Men laughed. Someone called out that the county ought to pay a man to haul it away rather than sell it. And Sarah Coltrane, standing at the back of the small crowd with her father's voice suddenly loud and clear in her memory, a boat is a promise a man made to the water, found herself raising her hand and offering $4. Nearly half of everything she had left in the world, for a wreck that every sensible person in Cedar Bend had already decided was worthless. She told herself, walking down to the water's edge afterward to look at what she had bought, that she had done it because the timber alone might be worth something. Oak being oak even after 20 years of river water, and because she had nowhere to sleep and a hull with a roof of sky was still, technically, shelter. She did not entirely believe her own explanation even as she made it. There had been something else pulling at her, something she could not name, the particular attentive silence her father used to fall into when a piece of wood struck him as unusual. And she felt that silence now, standing over the half-sunken barge with the cold river lapping at its blackened ribs, though she could not yet have said why. The barge, once she and a boy she'd hired for 50 cents had bailed and dragged her partway onto the bank, revealed herself to be larger and, strangely, sounder than her reputation suggested, a flat-bottomed cargo hauler perhaps 40 feet long, built heavy and low in the old army style, with iron fittings along her gunwales that spoke of a working vessel rather than a pleasure craft. Painted letters, worn nearly to nothing, still traced a name along her bow, the Dorothy Ann. Sarah spent her first night sleeping in the driest corner of the hull under a tarp she'd begged from a sympathetic dockhand, and it was on that first night, running her hands along the planking out of nothing more than old habit, her father's habit, checking the honesty of the wood, that her fingers found a seam in the flooring that did not belong there. It was not rot. It was not damage. It was a joint, deliberately cut, deliberately hidden beneath a layer of tar and grime. The kind of joint her father would have called a boatwright's confession, a place where someone who knew what they were doing had built a lie into an honest hull. She did not open it that first night. She told herself it was because she had no proper tools and no good light, and both of those things were true. But the truer reason was that some part of her already understood that whatever lay beneath that seam had been hidden by someone who very much did not want it found. And a woman who has just lost everything learns to be careful about what kind of trouble she invites into her life. She lay awake instead, listening to the river working at the hull the way it had worked at it for 20 years, and thought of her father's voice, and did not sleep much at all. It took her 3 days to work up the courage, and when she finally did, prying at the hidden seam with a flat iron bar borrowed from a blacksmith named Thomas Riddick, a broad, careful man who had watched her drag the barge onto the bank and had taken a quiet, unasked for interest in helping her, the false floor lifted away to reveal a shallow compartment built into the barge's keel, dry as a bone despite 20 years underwater. Packed with oiled canvas and sealed with wax that had somehow held. Inside the canvas, wrapped with a care that spoke of a man who had once expected to come back for it, Sarah found a strong box of iron, a leather dispatch case gone stiff with age. And a smaller bundle that, when she unwrapped it with trembling hands, proved to be coin, federal gold coin, dozens of it, dulled but uncorroded. More money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. Thomas Riddick, kneeling beside her in the lamplight, went very quiet, and then said what she herself had already begun to suspect, that a barge listed as abandoned army property, sunk deliberately. Its treasure hidden and sealed rather than lost by accident, was not a piece of bad luck that had happened to the United States Army. It was a theft that someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make look like bad luck. The dispatch case held the answer, though it took Sarah and Thomas the better part of a week. Working by lamplight in the church basement, Reverend Amos Hale lent them once he understood what they had found, to make full sense of the water-stained pages inside. What they pieced together was this: in the autumn of 1866, a detachment of the 62nd United States Colored Infantry, mustering out after garrison duty along the river, had been owed back pay that had been delayed through the chaos of the war's final years, pay that had finally been authorized and loaded, in gold coin, aboard the very barge Sarah now owned. To be carried downriver to a paymaster's office where the soldiers, many of them formerly enslaved men who had fought to secure freedoms not yet a year old, were to receive what they were legally due. The barge, according to the official Army record enclosed in the dispatch case, had struck a snag in a night storm and gone down with all hands surviving but the payroll lost to the river. An unrecoverable misfortune, the file noted, in the flat language of men who had long since stopped being surprised by the Army's failures toward its black soldiers. But the muster roll folded inside that same case, in a hand Sarah did not recognize but Thomas eventually did, told a different story, a private ledger, unofficial and precise, listing every man owed and every dollar due. Annotated in the margins with calculations that had nothing to do with an honest accounting and everything to do with how much a young quartermaster's clerk could keep for himself if the barge were made to disappear rather than arrive. The clerk's initials, small and careful at the bottom of the ledger's final page, were E.M. Sarah sat with that page for a long time before she said his name aloud, because some part of her had already known, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky fully turns. And saying it felt like the last door closing on a version of her life where Elias Merrow was simply an unfortunate man who had been too hard on a grieving widow rather than a man who had built his entire fortune on a theft from soldiers who had already given everything they had. Reverend Hale, when they brought him the ledger, went to see a man in town whom neither Sarah nor Thomas had thought to ask, Isaiah Freeman, 71 years old, who ran a small cooperage at the edge of Cedar Bend's colored district and who, it turned out, had served in the 62nd Infantry himself and had waited 23 years for a payment that never came. A debt so old and so thoroughly buried by official silence that even his own children had stopped believing he would ever see it. When Isaiah Freeman held the muster roll in his hands and found his own name on it, third from the top, he did not weep, though Sarah half expected him to. He simply sat very still for a long moment. And then said, quietly, that he had always believed the river had swallowed the truth along with the gold, and he was glad, before he died, to learn that the river had only been keeping it safe. It did not take long for word to travel that the widow Coltrane had bought a worthless barge and found something in it. Though for a while the town's gossip assumed it was nothing more than a rusted keg of nails or a curiosity worth a few dollars to a collector. Sarah and Thomas and Reverend Hale kept the full truth close, aware that a discovery of this size, touching a man as prominent as Elias Merrill, needed to be handled with more care than Cedar Bend's rumor mill could offer. But secrets in a small river town rarely hold their shape for long, and it was Merrill himself, coming to call on Sarah at the boarding house where she now lodged, who forced the matter into the open. He came alone, in the evening, with the same warm, sorrowful voice he had used the day he took her farm, and told her he had heard she'd found some old army relics in that barge. And that as a matter of public duty, and, he added, out of concern for her own safety. Handling unstable old ordnance and government property being no small risk for a woman alone, he would be glad to take the items off her hands and see them properly returned through the banks. Connections to the county authorities. Sarah, who had spent 18 years learning to read the wood beneath a false surface, looked at him across the boarding house parlor and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she was looking at the same young clerk who had sunk that barge 23 years before, grown older and richer and considerably better dressed, but not, underneath it, a different man at all. She told him, politely, that she would think on his generous offer, and she watched something behind his eyes go cold and careful when she did not simply hand the ledger over on the spot. What followed was not a dramatic war but the slow, grinding kind of conflict familiar to anyone who has ever stood against a man with money in a town that depends on his money to survive. Merrow did not threaten Sarah outright, he was too practiced for that, but within a week the boarding house where she lodged found reasons to raise her rent beyond what she could pay. And Thomas Riddick discovered that an order of iron he'd been counting on from a supplier in St. Louis had been mysteriously cancelled, and Reverend Hale was visited by two members of his own church board, both men who held notes at the Cedar Bend Trust, gently suggesting that stirring up old grievances about the war was not the kind of thing that built up a congregation. It was the sort of pressure that left no fingerprints, the sort a poor widow with no lawyer and no standing was expected to simply absorb and go quiet under. As Merrow had clearly absorbed plenty of quiet compliance from people in her position before. But Sarah Coltrane had spent 3 years running a farm alone after Daniel died, learning the hard way that quiet compliance rarely saved anyone, and she had, more importantly, an ally in Isaiah Freeman that Merrow had badly underestimated, a man who, in 23 years of waiting, had quietly kept in contact with two other survivors of the 62nd Infantry, one in St. Louis and one as far as Illinois, both of whom had likewise never received their pay and both of whom, it turned out, still had family with the standing and the literacy to write a very persuasive letter to the War Department. Sarah spent 3 long nights at Reverend Hale's kitchen table, copying the muster roll and the dispatch case's official file in her own careful hand. Her father's old lessons about honest joinery coming back to her in a new form as she made certain every copy was exact, every figure accounted for, every name spelled correctly. Because she understood instinctively that a claim built on sloppy work could be picked apart by a man like Merrow, while a claim built with the same care her father put into a hull would hold against any weather. Isaiah's contacts, together with the letters Sarah and the Reverend sent, reached a quartermaster corps investigator in St. Louis named Colonel Reeves, a methodical man nearing retirement who had, as it happened, spent much of his career quietly chasing down old Reconstruction-era payroll discrepancies that nobody else wanted to touch, and who recognized in the ledger's careful, damning arithmetic exactly the kind of evidence he had spent 20 years hoping someone would finally hand him. Colonel Reeves arrived in Cedar Bend on a gray morning in early spring, and his arrival alone did more to change the temperature of the town than anything Sarah could have managed on her own. Because an officer of the United States Army asking pointed questions at the Cedar Bend Trust carried a weight that a widow's accusations, however true, could not. Merrow, to his credit or perhaps only to his shame, did not run. He stayed and tried, in a series of increasingly strained conversations that half the town seemed to witness one way or another, To reframe the theft as a misunderstanding, a wartime confusion, an old debt that could surely be resolved quietly and generously between gentlemen, a phrase that made Isaiah Freeman. Standing at the back of the bank one afternoon with his hat in his hands and his name on a page that had waited 23 years to be read, say nothing at all. Because there was nothing left to say that the ledger did not already say for him. The town meeting called at the church that April, packed to its doors. Farmers and dockworkers and the whole of the small colored congregation Isaiah belonged to sitting shoulder to shoulder in a way Cedar Bend's segregated pews had rarely allowed before, was. In the end, less a trial than a reckoning that had simply been delayed for 23 years and finally caught up with the man who thought he'd outrun it. Colonel Reeves laid out the official record beside the private ledger, sentence by sentence, sum by sum. And when he read the names of the men of the 62nd Infantry who were owed that gold, Isaiah Freeman's among them. Spoken aloud in that packed church for the first time in a generation, there was a stillness in the room that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. The particular stillness of people finally hearing a truth they had suspected but never been permitted to say. Elias Marrow did not deny the ledger was in his hand, he could not, having written every figure of it himself at 22 years old. And though he tried once more to speak of hardship and youth and the passage of time, the room had no patience left for it, and by the week's end the bank's directors, protecting what remained of their own reputations, had removed him from his position, and the Army's own inquiry, moving with a speed no one expected from an institution so famous for its slowness, brought federal charges against him for the theft of government property and the willful deprivation of soldiers' pay. The gold itself, once its provenance was fully confirmed, was distributed, not to Sarah, though the Army did, at Colonel Reeves's insistence, award her a formal salvers payment for the recovery. Enough to clear every debt she carried and buy back a modest piece of land of her own, but principally to the surviving men of the 62nd Infantry and the families of those who had died still waiting. Isaiah Freeman receiving, at 71 years old, the full back pay he had been owed since 1866. With interest the Army calculated to the penny out of what Sarah suspected was less legal obligation than plain shame. What remained after every rightful claim was settled, a modest sum but a meaningful one, Sarah proposed, and the town, chastened and grateful in roughly equal measure, agreed, should go toward a fund to rebuild the very dock where the Dorothy Inn had sat rotting for 20 years, and to establish, beside it, a small free school for the children of Cedar Bend's colored families, who had never had one of their own. It seemed to Sarah the only fitting use for money that had been meant, all along, for men who had given everything they had and been made to wait far too long to be repaid. Sarah Coltrane was 43 years old, and she had begun this year with nothing but a tin trunk, a mourning dress, and $11, cast out by a man she had once trusted, left with no farm, no husband, and no clear path forward. She had spent 4 of those last dollars on a wreck that the whole of Cedar Bend agreed was worthless, and had been laughed at in the mud of the public dock for doing it. But she had learned, long before that morning, from a quiet boatwright who believed that would remembered everything done to it, that value was rarely where the world expected to find it. And that an honest thing, however battered, however overlooked, however deliberately buried under 20 years of silence, could still be found by someone willing to kneel down and look closely enough. What she found inside that barge's hidden hull was never really gold, not in the end, not in the way that mattered, it was a debt finally paid. A name finally spoken aloud in a church that had never spoken it before, an old soldier finally allowed to rest easy, and a town given, however reluctantly, the chance to become a little more honest than it had been the day before. She kept the Dorothy and herself, restored and reglazed, moored at the new dock as a kind of quiet monument, and it became, in the years that followed, something of a local custom for the schoolchildren to walk down and touch her worn planking on their way to their first day of class, though most of them, we imagine, never fully understood why. We hope this story reminded you that the things the world calls worthless are so often only waiting for someone patient enough to look past the surface. If you found value in that idea, we'd love for you to share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and to leave a comment telling us, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had written off? We read every one of them, and they mean more to us than you know. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for letting Sarah Coltrane's story find its way to you. Until next time, stay close.